Well, I've got a few here that I can start with, and so we'll see. Um, to the folks at AECOM on the bridges, how do you guys decide? Obviously, it's very complicated on number one design, whether you're doing, vertical lift span or bascule or that type of thing, and then also building kind of on the um, current pathway, or whether you're gonna, and I think at least one of yours is being built while rail operations continue, but or whether you're going to go off the current corridor slightly and build next to it. So if you want to talk a little bit about that and the
Yeah,
complications as you work through that.
yeah, thank you, Nate. I can take that one. So for example, on the Devon Bridge, we went through the conceptual engineering phase and produce a report. And in that phase, we look at a whole host of different alternatives, whether it's track alignment options, maintaining the existing track alignment, or offsetting the alignment. Again, looking at different movable bridge uh, alternatives, a bascule or vertical lift, and then different fixed span alternatives. And essentially, you're looking at what are the pros and cons of each alternative? What are the impacts? What are the costs associated with each one? And then as we go now into the NEPA phase, we're going to be looking at what are the environmental impacts for each one. So just for example, like we looked at a few different track alignments, and um, we one of the alignments was to shift the tracks to the north. But UI has some facilities there. There's some historic buildings there. You get into some rights of way issues, some contaminated materials issues, and so nothing has been eliminated at this point. But I think the preferred alternative is to stay on the current alignment and do the stage construction in two stages, maintaining two tracks active in each direction. Um, and then, it's similar for, the movable span or the fixed spans. They have their pros and their cons. I think those will come down to, cost has a major implication. But that's I'm starting to ramble here, but those are some of the constraints that you're looking at. And when you do the conceptual engineering report, basically we set up a matrix with a scoring criteria, and we have a bunch of criteria, and we score each alternative and come out with basically our recommended or preferred alternative. Um, and then we'll continue to refine that as we go through the NEPA process.
And so kind of following on to that, how much back and forth, Janek talked a lot about railroad coordination and, making sure whether it's passenger or freight, right, prioritizing traffic and making sure folks still get to where they need to be, their freight needs to be. How long a process is engaging the railroad and working through those types of issues? And I can talk, maybe Biana can speak to this as well, but from experience, I know that can be complicated, but and you start well in advance, but how much back and forth is there as you prepare for some of these, significant bridges and is there times where you absolutely got to have an outage, and how do you coordinate that as you move the project forward?
Yeah, I can start and maybe Yana could jump in, but it's paramount to engage the operator as soon as possible and start that conversation. The last thing we can do is impact, service. Um, and so there is a back and forth, and you say, I think we're going to need a long-term two-track outage, and well, there's certain crossovers that need to be installed as part of the project then, so that we can maintain operations, and that's all part of the discussion. And as you get further along the process into the final design, and you're starting to look at your construction schedules, then you're writing your specifications, what track time is available to the contractor, and that sort of thing. And that's also conversations we're having with Metro North the whole way.
Yeah, if I can join in at the concept stages, and we ask that you get in touch with us. So when you're thinking about what project you want to build, we can start entertaining those ideas and start providing you with ideas as to how you can go ahead and build it without impacting the service, at least not impacting it too much. And then with some of the things that you want to take into account, because certain options that you might think are viable may not be viable. And then we might actually come up with some options that you may have not thought of. So we ask to work together in a collaborative approach. So as Andre said, as it gets down the line into the writing of the specifications and what the outages actually are, it's also very good to talk to us about the potential means and methods, because the means and methods will greatly impact on the type of support that we have to provide or what it is that we can or cannot approve. And so if we're involved in the writing of the specifications and the outages and so forth, we can help dictate some of those means and methods. And I know that mostly people don't like to dictate means and methods because you're taking some of the initiative away from the contractor, and you want the contractor to propose the best, most economical solution. But sometimes the best, most economical solution will cause a tremendous service disruption. So we ask to be involved in that planning stage so we can impact, number one, the concept of the whole project, number two, the means and methods of construction.
All right, we'll move down the list. We have one for, let's see, Carolyn and Yure. How challenging on your organization is gearing up for all this construction? Seems like, can be very disruptive. Big change in construction intensity, not necessarily even thinking about, managing the impact on the existing services. So it's a little similar to what we were just talking about, but kind of at the ConnDOT level. I mean, how do you prepare for some of these massive projects, and then how do you kind of going back to organizing the project and overseeing the project? How do you keep all these on track?
Yeah, good morning. I can start. This is Yure. So as we talk about the strategic planning, about all of the work that needs to happen, I know Janek touched base on a lot of good examples about the disruptions, to the Northeast corridor, all the work that is going to happen. We have been working very closely with Janek too and Metro North as far as resources and Amtrak too. But it does take a lot of strategic planning to make sure that we minimize the disruption to the railroad. We understand that this is a once in a lifetime opportunity with all of the funding that Carolyn talked at the point. And that's, I know we understand it's going to be a lot of suffering, but it does, again, as we talk about minimizing the disruption, and we'll talk about the other question too about how do we do this, right? So it's, right now, as we talk about innovation and how we're going to do this, we talk about the time for CT and the track improvement and mobility. Just to give you an example, we completed the catenary replacement program. Lessons learned, a lot of disruptions, a lot of track outages. That's the reason right now we are concentrating on blocks, so we can do all of the work at that specific block, including the bridges, catenary, as Caroline mentioned, the time program. But there's a lot of coordination and communication. And I don't know if Janek, if you want to add something to that, because again, we have been doing a lot of coordination as far as resources and make sure we plan it accordingly.
Yes, we've been working very, very closely with Yure and his team, and we're working on it right now. The number of projects that are coming down the pike are exceeding our ability to support. So we are doing a very deep dive into figuring out exactly what it is that we need to do to support those projects in terms of manpower and other resources, equipment, and so forth. And so that we can hire up the proper number of people and not delay these projects. So it's going to be a lot of work, but working hand in hand with CDOT, and we're very appreciative of the collaboration.
So I'll do a little follow on in that regard, Janek. I mean, are you guys, you folks able to find people, or are you using a lot of outside consultants or some of that? I mean, we always hear some of the challenges, whether it's at the DOT or in talking to the railroads in the state. Like everybody, qualified folks are hard to find, or people, interested in entering the industry and that type of thing. So maybe it's a little better down there in Connecticut, New York area, but I'm just kind of curious from folks, whether it be at the DOT or at Metro North. I mean, are you having reasonable luck at bringing folks in, or is that a challenge?
I guess I can start. When it comes to the crafts, it is difficult because it's a very tough market right now. A lot of industries that we compete with, such as the telecommunications industry and the power industry, are paying better than we do. The second thing is that for someone to come in and work on the railroad, they have to be qualified to do some of this work, and that's 2 years of training and testing before they are qualified to do some of this work. So we can't just hire somebody off the street and then put them to work the very next day. We have to hire them and then put them through 2 years of training, and then they'll qualify to go out and do the work. So there's a lot of planning that is required to be done so that things can be done in advance, so that we're not playing a game of catch up. On the walk bridge is an excellent example of that having been done. We sat down, we worked out with the state of Connecticut as to the type of support they would need in terms of the crafts. We then hired up the people, we trained them. We now have those people in place, and so we're ready to support the walk bridge project. Now we have to do is sit down and figure out, which we're doing right now, the support that will be required for all the other projects, because walk bridge is one of all of those many projects that are out there.
All right, and this one is for any of the panelists. You know, what are some of the latest innovations being incorporated into rail planning, design, construction, and maintenance activities? I did notice in the AECOM presentation, I think Patrick showing the monitoring devices. That's interesting, and kind of as a follow on for myself, you know, how do you by kind of overall engineering decide where to put those monitoring devices? Assuming you're putting those on what's perceived as the weakest part of the bridge or the most challenging part of the bridge, you know, right now, as opposed to, you know, if those are just spot monitors, or if they're kind of throughout the bridge, and how does that work, as well as other innovations out there.
Yeah, I'll start with the Devon Bridge interim repair project. So you mentioned, as I showed in the slides, we're installing a structures monitoring system, or strain gauges, basically throughout the entire bridge. There's about 150 sensors that we're installing, but they're not, obviously not just randomly placed. There's a design behind that. Basically, like you said, we're trying to pinpoint the most significant members. We're using some information from past load ratings, et cetera, inspection reports, to sort of target the most important members to monitor. And then essentially we're placing those sensors in a way that we can use that information to calibrate that finite element model later on. So it was quite a back and forth design process between our structural engineers and our monitoring guys and our modelers to come up with that design, the placement of the sensors. One other innovative approach that we're using on another project, it wasn't covered in the slides, but it's related here. AECOM is working on the Time 1 job, which is a 3-mile stretch between Stratford and Bridgeport. And there's 6 railroad bridges along that stretch that are being rehabbed as part of that project. And 2 of the bridges are 3-span structures, Main Street in Stratford and Bishop Ave in Bridgeport. And for those 3-span structures, the challenge is figuring out how to incorporate the longitudinal braking and traction forces on the substructures, and those forces are massive. And so one of the innovative ways we're looking at doing that is to introduce partial depth, ultra high performance concrete link slabs to basically convert the 3-span structure into a continuous for live load structure, which is helping to translate those longitudinal forces over away from the piers. So that's something that we're excited about implementing.
I can add some information on the planning side of some innovative things too. Two of the things I've noticed across New England and elsewhere is one of the things is GIS mapping. That's a well-used technology at this point in the industry, but I've noticed the past 3 to 5 years, the way we can use that has really changed. The amount of information we can store, how we can visualize the information has really changed, whether it's particularly in terms of how we communicate these analyses to other people and how we share data generally. One of the things we're doing with a couple of our partners is through a combination of GIS mapping that allows us to store a lot of data points. We also can use some other database management techniques that allow some of our partners to better understand and manage their information in a more efficient process. And while that may not translate directly to travel time savings or increased freight loads, it reduces the administrative hurdles and burdens that are associated with many of these projects. So I think some of the ways we shared information amongst consultants, amongst railroads has changed. And then and I think that sort of relates to Dale's question about the climate impacting. I think the new ways we can analyze information and the degree to which we can analyze information through Andre's sensors or through some of our mapping capabilities has really advanced that. And then one final innovative way I would say, once again, this is maybe more innovation from a policy perspective, but I've noticed with some of the railroads that have applied for grants the last couple of years, for a long time, a lot of grants were, hey, our tracks need repairs, our bridge needs some updates, but they're lacked sort of maybe a more comprehensive vision. And I'm seeing some cool things both in the passenger side, but also in the freight side, where with some of the recent infrastructure bills passed and with these available approaches to money, people are rethinking how they're applying for grants. They might be stringing together two unrelated projects that we can prove via data analysis are in fact related. So I think the innovation happening on the grant side is more that there's a new willingness to apply for riskier projects, not risky from a project perspective, but risky from an opportunity to be awarded perspective. And I think there's an appetite and an understanding amongst many in the industry that this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to get some funding for serious projects. And I think that has led people to be more creative in how they're applying for funding.
And maybe I can add on the construction phase as we talk about innovations. Most of the previous projects have been the typical construction methods, the design, bid, build. But now we have been looking at different construction methods, design, build, construction management at risk. Our Stanford parking garage was just completed under a design build project. So we're looking at all of that, and also on the bridges, as Andre mentioned, we talk about the ABC, the accelerated bridge construction we would have done at Atlantic Street. So different ways to minimize the disruptions to the rail operations during construction.
So to kind of follow on, Dale had a question in regard to, and it was partially addressed, but in climate change, or in any of your projects with any of these bridges or approaches, or just in general, any of your older lines, are you seeing challenges related to climate change and sea level rise? And if so, I'm assuming again, as you design and plan and build these projects, you're looking at resiliency and what kind of things are you doing if you are impacted by that?
Maybe I can start. So as we know, the New Haven line, the Northeast Corridor runs parallel to the shoreline, and we know that we have a lot of challenges as far as water levels. The Connecticut DOT attended an ARIMA sustainability and resiliency, but we have been adding, as we talk about elevations on our projects, just try to make sure that all of that is included in the projects. A lot of challenges over the years have been washouts, so it's been a challenge. We want to make sure that as we build the infrastructure, that we build it not for tomorrow, not for the next 10 years, but I'm going to say for the next century. So we have all that planned. And as we learn more from not only the West Coast, but what's happening on the East Coast, I know it is important to include that, and we have been working on our projects on that.
And is part of that is, and it looks like most of these are, you know, bridge related upgrades, you know, track, things like that. But is there any upgrades in any of these projects where you're going to electric catenary versus diesel or anything in that regard?
Yes, we talk about the rail network in Connecticut. We have the passenger rail and we have also the freight rail. As we talk about passenger, right now we are having different studies, and actually AECOM is helping us with that, to looking at the electrification on some of the passenger lines that are non-electrified. That's the Hartford line, the Danbury branch line, and the Waterbury branch line. So that is the goal also as we talk about equipment and as we talk about the climate and the electricity and power and all of that. So that's you know, what we're doing right now. But as we talk about the freight, there is also the freight network where there's a lot of tracks. You know, we have been talking with the freights about the future, about possibly electrifying or what will be the needs for that. But I think, you know, as we talk about the strategic planning again, we'll have to focus on the different phases and look at both options as we move forward.
Okay, and I'm gonna throw one out to Caroline here because she hasn't had much of a chance here. So I'm just wondering in regards to a lot of your money came from the Northeast Corridor pot there. And so kind of in that regard, you know, obviously some states can get into that pot and others are not, like Maine is not in the Northeast Corridor. So that's not a pot that we could apply for. But kind of you talked about, you know, a lot of success, but kind of overall, was there other projects that you weren't successful in getting? And then also in that regard, you talked about the amounts awarded and the importance of match. Roughly, what is across the board in your projects the breakdown of federal versus local or Connecticut?
Yeah, so the grants that I focused on today were the FSP NEC awards. Like you said, it was that pot of money specifically for those states on the Northeast corridor. And we applied for 13 projects and only won 8 of those. So some of the projects that we did not win funding for that we did apply for was our Time 5 project, our New Haven station platform replacement project, the Stamford Transportation Centers to redesign that center. So those one we applied basically to start the planning process for that. In addition to Stamford Station, it was for Hartford Station relocation. So it was also funds to start planning and relocating. We have a Greater Hartford mobility study in Connecticut, and where we're realigning some of the highways, and in that we'll have to realign the railroad. So removing the station, so those funds were applied to start the planning process on that. And then lastly, the Cosca Bridge was our 4th big movable bridge. That is the 4th one in the line for movable bridge replacements in Connecticut, at least on the New Haven line of the ones that Connecticut owns. And we applied for funds for planning on that as well. We weren't successful in those. A lot of the feedback we got is some of those projects, they were looking more for more projects that were more baked. These were some kind of planning programs. So in this next round, we will look towards, you know, our projects that maybe need additional money for construction, but also if we can get money to kind of start planning these additional projects as well. In addition to other funding, I mean, Connecticut is pursuing additional pots of money as well. Any pots of money are that we are eligible for, we are going to apply. I know you mentioned that, you know, the NEC bucket was particular for just the Northeast Corridor states, but the Fed State Partnership National Program is also available to other states as well. Connecticut, our Hartford line was designated as a corridor ID. So we are actually now eligible to apply for that program as well as on our Hartford line. So that'll be another project we might apply for as well. But for the time being, you know, our focus, we're happy with the money that we won, and we're kind of strategically thinking as to what to go forward to next year, whether that's through, the FSB NEC or the national program, in addition to a couple other opportunities, whether that's CRISI or the, railroad crossing elimination, as well as restoration enhancement. So a few other grants that Connecticut is continuing to look at, and if we apply, hopefully we get the funding.
Okay, thank you. Now it's a ongoing challenge to complete these projects, and usually a lot of times they'll take multiple buckets.
Yes.
We're gonna do one last question here as we're winding down. It's regarding the Time One job. It seems like the railroad owners typically prefer simple spans. Have you gotten any pushback, and how have you justified the use of the link slabs and the introduction of continuity into the structure?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So railroad simple spans are generally preferred. We would agree with that, and that's the way we initially set out with our design. What we ended up finding was that because the longitudinal forces were so great, our piers, the footings were becoming obsessively massive, which were starting to impact utilities and the available space to allow traffic during construction. And also the pier stems themselves were solid wall piers, which is a problem because one of the bridges is directly adjacent to a station. And so you would create this tunneling effect where, it wouldn't feel very safe to walk through this tunnel potentially at night. And so we looked at several different options to alleviate this concern. And one that we came up with is this link slab idea, which would, the bridge is still simple span. It's got separate bearing lines, but the link slab makes it continuous for live load. And what that's able to do is move the live load or the longitudinal force off of the pier onto the abutment. That will allow us to significantly reduce the size of those pier footings and also incorporate an open column style pier instead of a solid wall pier. So I would say pushback, no, but there was definitely conversations about the advantages and disadvantages of implementing this link slab. We had discussions with Connecticut DOT and Metro North about that. Ultimately, the consensus was the advantages of implementing the link slab outweighed the disadvantages.
Okay, and I jumped the gun. We've still got time for one more. In regards to and maybe this is for the AECOM folks again, do you incorporate overseas innovation in regard to planning and work patterns, maybe for the operators as well, maybe for Janek as well?
So I can start. I was actually in the process of typing a response before when we heard the final question warning, but the simple answer is yes. And I think as it comes to railroad, I think many people will ask, well, are you looking at what Europe's doing? And it's not just Europe. I think there are many examples across the globe where there's opportunities for us to look into what's being done in different places. There's caveats like different areas have different environmental legislations, different regulatory processes and the like, but there are some really interesting things happening elsewhere that I'm learning more about. One thing I'm doing some background research on right now is alternate powers for freight. So a lot of freight that moves in the United States is diesel powered right now, but something I've done some light background research on in Europe and elsewhere is what would it take to maybe electrify some freight transportation. I think there's one electric freight operator in the United States in like Indiana, but I've been learning a little bit more about what some other countries are doing in terms of freight movements, which is one example amongst many, but certainly there's whether it's in Asia, whether it's in Europe, or even in sub-Saharan Africa, there's some really cool lessons to be learned.
Okay, with that, I want to thank everybody again and the panelists today for taking the time and for recording the presentations previously and then taking the time today to come in. It was a good session, a lot of questions. Great discussion. Appreciate everybody out in the audience. These presentations will be available to view online by the end of the first week of March. Right now, the conference will be taking a break until noon. And then we'll return with a session at 2. I'm sorry, session 2 at noon. The future of rail workforce in New England, and touched a little bit on workforce in this ongoing thing that we're certainly seeing up here in Maine in regards to railroads. So this break is sponsored by WNEU and UConn. We look forward to seeing everybody after the break, and thanks again.